Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. From Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the palatial FYC studios, you are listening to For Your Consideration,
the podcast featuring roundtable discussions reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm your host, Dustin Friesenand.
And I'm your host, Mike Josek, and we'd like to welcome everybody to the show, wherever you happen to be getting this thing funneled into your ear holes, whether it's Apple Podcasts or YouTube or Spotify or all good podcast providers. We just like to suggest that if you are getting it off of Apple, please rate and review the show while you're there. It still helps with the algorithms, and it's huge for getting the show into the eyes and ears of people who may be interested in the content, but just don't know we're out there. If you're a regular listener to the show, welcome back. And if you're a first-time listener, just be warned, spoilers ahead. Now, as we stated on our last episode, the film that we are covering today, Dustin, we've been covering a lot of movies from the 20s.
I think this is our official list film, though, isn't it?
It is, but it's still like silent films from the 20s for a film podcast.
Not really.
I think we've actually
a lot
done
of the
number.
30s, Kay. They were mostly the 30s.
No,
Metropolis was 30.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, it is.
No, it wasn't.
I'll fight you.
Anyways, all debating aside, the film that we decided that we were going to do. Sorry, let me rephrase that. The film I decided that we were going to do this time around was the 1922 Danish-Swedish documentary-ish film, Haxan.
AKA Bitches Be Crazy, a documentary on the dangers of wandering uteri.
I want to address that right now, but I'm going to wait until later. So as I said, this was my pick, and I'm not sure what Dustin checked it out on, but I checked it out on the 2001 Criterion edition.
I did too, the full 2-hour version.
And I think that actually played a little bit into my overall reaction to it, partly for the technical specifications. And
I kind of wonder what the half hour was that was cut for the 78 version.
Well, looking on Wikipedia, like they list 4 parts. And the film has something like 7 parts.
7. Yeah, it has 7 parts, and specifically says at the beginning it'll be cut into 7 parts.
So they could very easily, without getting too far into it, I think they could probably have cut some of the witch trial stuff and still made their point. Or they might have just cut some of the stuff that had sort of explicit-ish material in it. Anyways, it's clear that we have things to say about this movie. So I'm going to do the credits, and we can get right into it. So Haxan, directed by Benjamin Christensen. Screenplay was by Benjamin Christensen. It starred Benjamin Christensen, Clara Pontoppidan, Oscar Streibold, Astrid Holm, and Maren Peterson. Cinematography was by Johan Ankerstjern. It was edited by Edla Hansen, distributed by Scandias Filmbyrå, and released in Sweden on the 18th of September, 1922. The film, at the time of its release, had a lukewarm response from critics. I think people were just kind of a little stymied by the approach and the subject matter. But it wasn't until, like so many films, later years, that critics started sort of reassessing it and looking back on it and determining that it's a film classic of early cinema.
And then future film critics in the year 2020 are looking back on those critics and wondering, do they know what the hell they're talking about? Which is the story of this show.
And where does this place on the Sight and Sound list, Dustin?
This place is 894th on the critics poll for the Sight and Sound Top Films of All Time, 2012 edition. Pew, pew.
That's interesting. I actually thought there'd probably be more people throwing their vote in for this, but considering early reaction...
Just the one.
So Dustin, this was the first time for both of us. You might have gone into it a little bit more blind than I did. What was your first reaction to this?
Initially, I thought it was just going to be a flat-out horror film. I had no idea what to expect, so I came in and it started off like a documentary, and I was like, oh, all right, we got a documentary going on here. That is actually a bit more interesting. Okay. And then about halfway through the film, they're throwing out numbers and sort of scaremongering. They're talking about how like every witch they killed brought out 10 more as people just started accusing everyone, and everyone was tortured to death, and 8 million people were killed. And I'm like, all right, this is starting to sound a little bit too much. So I did a little bit of research myself. Scholars are saying that it's not 8 million people a year, and it's more along the lines of like 50,000 who died over the period of 100 years. The Spanish Inquisition, only about 2.5% died as a result of the trials. Like, it actually seems like it's a fairly reasonable thing that was really blown out of proportion. So I'm looking at the documentary more as a exploitation film. I'm not too sure if they were doing that intentionally or if it's just what they understood from the one source text that they were mentioning. But I remember a review done by the Cinema Snob for a film called Black Love, which was sort of a fake documentary meant solely to be pornographic and blaxploitation at the same time. And that's how the rest of this film read, where it's just, all right, let's just have some scenes of torturing women and bitches being crazy. And then at the very end, when they start explaining it with modern science, I'm like, okay, this has got to be a joke. This has got to be ridiculous here.
That's so interesting that you read it that way, because I had a very different reaction to it. I mean, it was obviously steeped in like 1920s amateur scholarship, and it was heavily researched at the time by Christensen, and he was very much.
At one hand, I blamed him. On the other hand, that is just how it's read from all the reviews on exploitation films that I've seen. This is how it would look.
And he very much wanted to create an educational thing. He wanted to, it plays like an essay. I mean, there's a debate as to just how much of a documentary this is. It's widely regarded that Nanook of the North is the first true documentary.
Even though that one was a complete BS fest that the Inuit people hate the shit out of, that's for sure.
And this clearly isn't in the time of like Ken Burns' documentary where you can just have, a whole bunch of photographs and stock footage and whatever. I mean, he does start the film. Christensen has images from texts that he is just putting the camera on and showing you, and he's like pointing it out to you, and he creates like little dioramas and stuff. So much of the film is something that you can't document in the way that you would want to document on film, at least in 1921. And he does dramatizations so that it's not just all narration, like so people can actually kind of get a sense of maybe what some of this stuff was kind of like. And yes, it does have, in some cases, kind of like a weird vibe to it, and it is very theatrical. But I really thought that he was very much talking in the vein of, this is the medieval view of witchcraft, and how much of a, air quote, witch hunt it became. The fact that you capture one person who isn't a witch, but you torture them until they finally confess to being a witch. And then when they confess, they like basically try to tear down everybody else that's with them, or are made to name other people.
Until eventually everyone's a witch and everybody's dead.
So, I mean, my reading of it was really showing just how shitty this religious patriarchal sort of society was. And the funny twist is that when he does, like you said, switch to the modern science, he is trying to be, I think, a lot more, empathetic or sympathetic to women. But like the view of women in 1920 was still light years away from where we are now.
That's the thing. He was trying to do a proper documentary, but doing it from a weird, ignorant halfway point.
But not necessarily ignorant at the time.
That's the thing. It wasn't ignorant at the time. But now, looking back on it, we're like, yeah, it's utterly ridiculous. But the one thing that really struck me is that at one point, right at the very beginning, he's talking about how sorceresses would use some ingredients that they got from sorcerers in order to make their potions and whatnot. That was the only time male witches were mentioned. Only time men were involved in magic whatsoever, just mentioned sort of offhand. After that, every single witch is generally a creepy old crone or it's just a young, attractive woman who made the one monk think dirty thoughts, so she ensorcelled him into thinking these naughty thoughts, and he had to be whipped clean and pure. And there are things like that that are entirely legit. You don't invent a hair shirt because you think comfort is good for you.
But he qualifies that stuff. He qualifies how the old, ugly crone would have been treated in society, and any kind of deformity or any trait that was viewed as unpleasant would instantly like put you in the target, in the crosshairs for being a witch. And,
oh, absolutely.
And he also talks about, he doesn't talk about, but he kind of dramatizes the young monk who is basically just having impure thoughts because that woman came earlier in the film and he's basically got a boner because he's not supposed to be talking to women. And so he tells the guy, and the guy, his superior, is like, oh, hey, here's someone that we can say is a witch. So he actually, the young monk is like, you didn't actually say she was a witch, did you? Like, I was just being sinful. There's nothing wrong with her. And then they go and they take her and they imprison her and they torture her and they do all that shit to her and they trick her and then they eventually kill her for being a witch. And I thought that was really interesting to show how that system basically just railroads these women, whether they're young and pretty or old and not so pretty. It felt very much like he was trying to defend, for me, it felt like he was trying to defend the position of these women, and also kind of saying that when you lived in that kind of a society, because he tries to explain this away with the hysteria bullshit at the end. I mean, we all know how bullshit hysteria is. But
literally wandering uterus from the ancient Greek, for any of you who don't know.
But basically
so they had to get the uterus back in spot, otherwise women would be crazy.
But basically saying that lack of education, superstition, and just religious blinders led a society to believe that any woman who seemed to be abnormal in some way, whether it was, anything that we would use today to describe it, whether it's, depression or anxiety or ADHD or, anything that's on the spectrum.
Though technically most of the stuff he was talking about wasn't even abnormalities. It was just being in the place at the wrong time. The weaver, she was just begging at the same time that the printer happened to be sick. And the other guy saw in the lead that he put in the water that it was witchcraft, this a whole system of superstitions that caused people to lash out at whomever. And under the assumption that it would be these poor, starving women who'd be reaching out to Satan, who then apparently they're willing to say, okay, I'll sell you my soul and I'll still be poor and starving because we're really bad at haggling, I guess. Even barter is our form of economics. We're just super shitty at it. And that's the thing. I did a little bit of research, and of course he didn't have information that I have from a quick Google search. And what I'm seeing is that the trials that I've always grown up with, the idea that, yeah, they're just going out killing everybody. That's the exaggeration that you see in all the films and all the media and all the representation. But I mean, you think about it for 2 seconds, who'd be alive at the end of that? Nobody. How could you do these tests over and over again and not be like, I'm going to try this test on an innocent person and see what happens? That's weird. I've gotten false positives 100 out of 100 times. Strange.
But the whole system of testing,
more sense.
It's like a witch can't cry. So when the woman's crying, they're like, see, she's crying. She can't be a witch. And the dude's like,
no. She spit on her hand and it's fake tears.
They smear spittle on their face. It's like, if they float, then they're a witch and you burn them. And if they don't float, then you just pray for their soul. Like every single test still ends up with killing a woman. It's just, you might have killed her.
Every single test is just utter insanity. And I think that there's almost sort of this idea of how people behaved back in the day that we assumed that they were just the most ignorant bastards ever, in particular in the Dark Ages, where we assumed that everyone was just living in a big pile of dirt somewhere at the side of the road. There's some scientific enlightenments which occurred only in the Dark Ages. There's even people who deny that the Dark Ages even happened. Our understanding of history is so skewed.
I love that you call them the Dark Ages because it's generally considered to be the Middle Ages, because Dark Ages is such a loaded
And that's exactly my point, that the Dark Ages,
Nomenclature.
calling it the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, we don't know. And any of the stuff that we find now, it makes it seem like a lot more reasonable of a time. For some reason, there's a big chunk of research or information about it that seems to have made up and exaggerated. And obviously that's not their fault in the making of this film, but just how it dates itself. It seems almost ridiculous to me.
I think it's really
I
hard
can point for, however.
I think it's really hard for a film that's 100 years old to not date itself. I mean, it's literally 98 years. It's just over 98 years old. So I don't know. I kind of think I'm going to hold like a different.
As far as I'm concerned, like Metropolis doesn't date itself. I think Metropolis is right up there with any film that comes out nowadays. I don't look at anything and I'm like, wow, that is dated as shit. I understand it's coming from the 30s. Sorry, Mike, 30. And it still looks good. It still holds up. But the problem with this one is that it's a documentary. So it's using the information they had 100 years ago. That by itself is going to date it. There's no way anything that they say is going to be accurate nowadays, just like anything we say nowadays is going to be completely inaccurate in 100 years.
Agreed. This film does operate under Metropolis was a science fiction film, which came out in 1927.
Damn it.
And yeah, this is
I'm thinking M, which once again, M doesn't feel super dated. It feels relevant, even though there's a lot of old kind of setups and everybody's smoking. And I can't believe how much cigarette smoke there is in that film. It blows my mind. We're going to talk about it when we do that film, but it doesn't feel super dated. It's not, I'm trying to think of a more modern example that feels super dated, but they work. Whereas with Haxan, all the information they're telling me, it feels wrong. So I'm watching the film almost taken one step even further back from it.
See, for
not
me,
just watching the film as a time capsule of what they thought in the 20s.
See, for me, I think there's still some information in this film that is valid. And I think that what it's trying to do is really, really interesting. And how it does it is really fascinating to me, because the level of craft that was brought to these dramatizations, like I said, everything from the little like dioramas and stuff that he does at the beginning of the film to kind of show you how early civilizations visualized sort of the universe, to
the scene with the Weaver where the gold is coming up out of the pile and she's reaching for it as Satan is taking away the gifts to try to tempt her. Fantastic. Like that's amazing for the time.
And the makeup, like the devil himself, who was played by Christensen, which is kind of interesting. He kept reminding me of the Dave Grohl devil from the tribute, because he's like doing the tongue thing. But great makeup, like great staging, great lighting, everything. The color filters used, the tones.
It is the most expensive Swedish silent film ever made.
It is exquisite to watch. And that's ultimately like what put this on my radar. I think I was watching either it was the Story of Film documentary, or it was Eli Roth's History of Horror. It was one of the two. And they were talking about Haxan, and they were showing clips from it. And they were showing these beautiful remastered clips. The Criterion edition is so goddamn gorgeous to look at. It stuns me to be seeing these images this clear and this beautiful. And they were showing these images of the devil doing his thing, like popping up and scaring people and stuff. And I was like, Jesus, this was in the 20s? This movie came out in 1922? This is insane. I have to watch this. And then finding out
the costuming was fantastic.
the skeleton horse that goes by in one scene, and the
anything.
And the audaciousness of it, when the Maria the Weaver is talking about, oh yeah, I've had many children by the devil, because she's finally just broken and she's telling them anything that they want to hear. And they show you these demons coming out of her. It was so theatrical and so strange. It was kind of like watching what might be like a modern, well-funded Midsummer Night's Dream kind of theatrical production where they actually, all these people with the fairy makeup and costumes and like animal hybrid things and chimeras, whatever. The fact that he brought this craft, because he also wanted it was supposed to be educational, but he also wanted it to be art. He wanted it to be a film. And I think if you're going to go easy on the sort of the scholarship, the only other real complaint I think you could have about this movie is the fact that it does sort of fuzz that line a little bit between documentary and fictional narrative. But the fictionalization or the fictional parts are in service to the documentary part, which is where
I'd have no issue with that whatsoever, because otherwise all you'd have is a bunch of scholars talking at the screen, which I have no problem with that form of documentary either. But here,
not only would you have a bunch of scholars,
it works in its favor.
Not only would you have a bunch of scholars talking at the screen, but it would be a silent film. So it would just be these like placards coming up.
To be fair, it does have a lot of these placards. It's like, and you look over here and then you just see the pencil come up and it's circling this, explaining that one picture, and he goes back and forth to it. It takes forever. It's so much easier when you can just have sound, And
he is very explicit that he is the narrator. He doesn't try at any point to say that this is factual. One of my favorite parts in this entire film.
He says very specifically, he sources his own text. He's like, I found this book, and from this book, this is the film that I'm making.
One of my favorite parts in the entire film is near the end where they're talking about the thumb screws, and he said that one of the actors on set, she wanted to try the thumb screw, and he actually filmed her trying it, and they show the like putting it on and they're like screwing it, and you can kind of see her reaction. You can tell when she's starting to feel the pain and she's kind of like, take it off, take it off, take it off. And it was filmed in a very that was one of the few moments where you actually see sort of verite footage, I guess. Like it's actual footage of an actor and somebody, possibly the director, like putting the thumb screws on.
I can agree with the underlying message that he was going for, that we have to turn away from superstition, move towards science. We can't just go around blaming women for every bad thing that happens. There's legit reasons for people's behavior, stuff like that. It's all just done in a really 1920s way. In fact, in a way that's very forward thinking for the 1920s. My understanding of the 1920s anyway. So I can't disagree with any of that.
I really wondered contextually or I really wondered about the context of it as far as being progressive, because we've been surprised by just about every film from the 20s that we've watched. We've
but
gone
most of them are where are they from? They're not really necessarily from North America.
True.
Metropolis was Germany. This is Sweden.
Buster Keaton was American, and it was comedy.
And that wasn't really forward thinking. It was just slapstick comedy.
It was just comedy.
White Zombie wasn't exactly forward thinking, and that's North American.
That was also a talkie. So
still the 30s. We were talking the age, not necessarily the film type.
I might also be thinking I've kind of been like, the 20s is a period that interests me historically, culturally, both in domestically and abroad. And I've recently been getting into some literature and some photography from the 20s, which surprises me sometimes with kind of where they're at. And when I see these films and I see, all this pre-code stuff, like we were surprised by there being nudity in Metropolis, and there's sort of some partial nudity in this, and there's discussion about air quote lewd, behavior, lewd acts, sexual acts, the way they talk about demonology, the stuff that they kind of portray, Satanism, the violence, the stuff. It might be kind of more of just what was able to be talked about at the time, and we just think it's a lot less of a progressive time, but it might have been.
Which is exactly the same mistake that they're making in this film about the Middle Ages. We have this preconceived notion about what the 20s were like we're so far ahead now, and they're just a bunch of idiots back then. And they're in the same thing. Oh, we're so far ahead with science now, but look at these weird superstitions they had back in the 500 AD sort of deal. It's the exact same kind of dumb mistakes that people are making. because we just blanket over them with this preconceived notion that we have. Whereas if you think about it for 2 seconds, if the Spanish Inquisition was that insane, if any of these witch trials were that insane, no one would be left.
But then you also have to think the stuff that is weird and interesting and progressive. Well, I guess the other thing from the 20s would be Un Chien Andalou, which also
Yeah,
had
I wouldn't call
nudity.
that progressive or not progressive. It's absurdist, so it's not exactly making any sort of political or social statement.
But progressive in the kind of content that it was showing, because it was showing like some really dark stuff and some really sexual stuff, and being applauded for it. But it's usually the avant-garde. It's usually the stuff that's not necessarily kind of popular at the time. You know, when you look at the classic 80s stations that play the 80s music, they tend to play a lot of the alternative indie new wave stuff, the stuff that wasn't on the radio, the stuff that was on college radio. Like The Cure was not being played in the 80s on any radio station in Saskatchewan. I can guarantee you that.
What you hear is like one song from every artist that existed in the 80s. You never hear any B tracks. You never hear side catalog. It's just...
It was the 80s for so many people was like Kenny Loggins and Richard Marx and Whitney Houston and just like top 40 stuff that wasn't pushing the envelope. It was just of the times. So I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing from this period probably is the stuff that was pushing the envelope. The stuff that has survived, the stuff that people are interested in and who have dedicated time and scholarship to.
I think the stuff that survived is probably the bigger thing, given that I read statistics like 30 to 40% are all that's left of the films that were made from back then, lost in one way, shape, or form.
To a certain extent, that is true, yeah. But I don't know, having not lived in the 20s and having never spoken to anybody who lived in the 20s,
it's hard to tell what kind of accuracy we have on any of this stuff.
I think I might have interviewed one person who was born in the late 20s, now that I think about it. But I never talked to them about that time, and they would have been too young. But yeah, basically, we got no one to ask. So sounding like terrible scholars right now. I won't admit to having a history degree.
Are you a historian? Then you can't tell me what happened yesterday.
The thing that most took me out of this movie, there were two things that basically took me out of this movie. I was either popping out and going, I wonder what Dustin's going to say about this. And the other thing was the music, which was kind of an odd choice, I think, in some cases. But the music used for the Criterion edition was actually restored recordings or restored score, new recordings of the original score as it appeared when it premiered in Sweden. So this was the music chosen by Christensen, and I thought
it's
it worked
a lot
in some
of classical
cases.
music, and I've read nothing but complaints about it. Everyone's just giving the classical music crap, like, oh, this doesn't fit or anything. It's one thing that did not bother me. I was waiting for it to bother me because I'd read that sort of mid viewing, and no, I had zero problem with the music whatsoever. It's just, all right, here's classical music. They're filling up space.
It took me out occasionally only because some of the music they used was music that I'm so familiar with because of Looney Tunes.
Well, let's face it, some of this was pretty Looney Tunes.
But it did occur to me that he might have chosen music that was not necessarily playing up to the scene, because some of the scenes did deal with like darker material, and he might have just been looking for something that was, you know, good background music, good accompaniment that would just keep you calm while you're watching.
It's not like he was playing the fifths during the torture scenes or Aldi or anything like that. It was there.
So I don't know if there's a lot more that we can say about this. I think if we keep going, we're just kind of going to go in circles. Do you have anything you want to add?
Now that we've already touched on the sound for the 2 seconds, I guess it deserved. I was expecting, if you had an actual issue with it, to have more to say.
No, I didn't have an issue per se. It occasionally popped me out because the music wasn't specific to the scenes, and because it was music that I was familiar with, because it was classic music that all of us are familiar with, and in some cases, like I said, there were like Looney Tunes connections. So there'd be like grave robbing or something going on the screen, but the music that they're playing, I'm thinking of like Bugs Bunny in the bar, or the What's Opera doc, which just created like some cognitive dissonance for myself. But that's probably, something unique to myself, or somebody who grew up in that generation where that cartoon is maybe kind of ubiquitous in our
I had all sorts of Looney Tunes growing up, but when I'm watching a silent film, I don't expect the music to really link up with what's going on scene. I expect the music to just be filler noise, essentially. And I expect it to, at times, be melodramatic and a little bit too much. And that's what takes me out sometimes. But here it was as background noise as you can get. They didn't do anything that was too jarring for my tastes. So not a huge deal.
Yeah.
But moving on into the judgment phase, I guess I'll start. As I like to say, I like to judge a film in part by its type, in large part by its type. And a documentary, the express purpose is generally education. And what I find is that because of the sheer way documentaries work, it's really hard to even have the notion of what could be a masterpiece for a documentary, because what information do we have is going to be accurate when we delve into it with better science, better knowledge about what's going on. And here, the information all taken from one source, they did what they thought was accurate, but looking back at that now, it's like that's ridiculous. And then blaming everything on hysteria and being like, oh, look at this poor woman who's stealing stuff, I'm just going to have to ban her from the store. You know how them women's get with their stealings. It's because her man died, and when a woman doesn't have a man to lead her around, it's just going to be the way it is. So you've got these outdated values and information about psychology, and it doesn't live up, but it is in and of itself extremely interesting film that belongs in a museum. There we go. So I can't give this a masterpiece at all. I'd like to. If it were just a film, I could possibly give it a masterpiece because it's interesting, but because it's a documentary, there's no way that I could. There's a lot of stuff that they do is very interesting, that's very advanced time, but it's a documentary, it's supposed to be accurate and educational. It fails at that. It fails at the conceit of its genre.
See, now I'm really torn, because originally I was going to give this masterpiece because I really like, as I've stated previously in the show, I like the technical aspects of it. I like the intention of it. I like the fact that, you pointed out Nanook of the North was kind of fraudulent. Whereas this
was entirely fraudulent. The guy who was acting in Nanook was told it was something completely different.
Whereas this, I think it rides that documentary line a lot better than something like that did, because this isn't fact, but it's not fraudulent.
This is very well intentioned.
And
very well intentioned.
I did have a different reading than you. You definitely saw, I think, a lot more misogyny in it.
Unintentional, but there.
the way that you describe it, like the blaming hysteria and stuff. And I thought he did that nicely, because even I cringed a little bit when he brought up the hysteria and the way that he was portraying it. And I realized that because he's talking about witches, and because witches is a female thing, that he was just carrying on with the female thing and trying to say, hey, don't judge women. It's not necessarily, get away from the superstition and get away from the whatever. And like, let's focus more on the science.
Not their fault they're crazy. It's problems in their brains.
Unfortunately, the science at the time wasn't the most woke in the 20s either, as far as women's concerns were.
It was only another 50 years before they'd legally be people.
That's right. So, I mean, for so many reasons, I want to say this is a masterpiece, but over the course of this conversation, I think that softened a little. And I think as much as I like it, as interesting as I think it is, as significant a document as I think it is, and as accomplished a piece of art I think it is, I'm reluctantly going to go with museum piece. I'm going to go with museum piece. I think that's fair.
That belongs in a museum.
It does make one wonder what his other films would have looked like.
I don't know if he did any more documentaries. I think he...
No, I mean just like other films, ones that aren't documentaries.
In the commentary, the guy whose name I can't remember, he was talking about Christensen's other films, and he spoke of them as having... They were like spy thrillers and mysteries and stuff like that, and they tended to have really good mood lighting. He would hire good actors. He was very good at staging scenes and telling a narrative and doing so in an interesting, artistic, dramatic way. So I don't think it would be a lot different from what we saw with Haxan, other than the fact that it would be like a straight up fictional narrative rather than him saying, so then I read this thing about this, and then I read this thing about this, and here's a dramatization of what I think that might look like.
And I think one of those films might be masterpiece worthy.
It's interesting, having said what I just said, it's the first time where I've really internalized, because he says, I've dramatized what I think that might look like. And I can see how that is viewed as potentially like on the exploitation side. But I still think because it walks that documentary line, it's like watching, this is kind of like the witchcraft version of Unsolved Mysteries of 1922 in Sweden.
Oh, it's absolutely like Unsolved Movies, but it's also like unintentional exploitation to an extent.
Yes.
The intent wasn't there to be bad at all. The intent was so very good. It just didn't age.
So there you have it. We have a consensus.
It took a while.
Although a mildly reluctant consensus. That's 2 museum piece votes for Haxan. We'd like to know what you think of the film. Have you seen it? Have you seen the wonderful Criterion edition that exists? Do you own it? Do you watch it? What did you think of our take on it? And what did you think of the film yourself? Let us know on our social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, either at FYC Show or For Your Consideration. If you search that, you'll pretty much find myself and Dustin on the internet somewhere. Feel free to like, follow, share, and subscribe to all the social medias and feeds and whatnot. Share us. Word of mouth is a powerful tool.
And join us next time when our film will be another foreign film, but a wee bit more new, The Host from Korea.
Oh, Bong Joon-ho.
Oh, I've been watching some of his stuff lately, and The Host is there.
I haven't seen The Host.
That the wife would not want to watch.
She doesn't want to watch The Host?
She doesn't like horror. It wouldn't necessarily be horror, but it would be a hard sell. Sometimes it's hard to sell stuff.
It's not really
it's
a horror.
Really an action either. It wasn't what I saw it the first time, and I remember being disappointed at that. I want to see it again because I do like Bong Joon-ho's stuff in a more smart Dustin age.
Yeah, I saw it when it first came out, thinking that it was going to be just this like great horror kaiju thing, and it surprised me because it was very different. It was a lot more comical than I thought it was going to be. But having seen other films of his, it'll be interesting going back to see this one and to see it with that filter. So cool. So join us next time for Dustin and myself on the podcast talking about Bong Joon-ho's The Host. Until then,
The Host with the Most.
The Host with the Most. So it'll be the 2 hosts talking about The Host. And one of us should be at the other person's place so that we could be hosting the hosts while watching the host and talking about the host. Getting all Inception level.
What happens after cubing? I know it's to the power of 4, but is there a special word for it? It's because it's not squaring. If a 4-dimensional is a tesseract?
Quadding?
Tesseracting?
So until then, everybody stay healthy.
We need a mathematician here.
So until next time, I've been your host, Mike Josic.
And I've been your other host, Dustin Friesenham.
Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time For Your Consideration.
Take care, everybody. I gotta stop assuming that you know what the hell you're talking about.